So I just got my invitation yesterday for the closed beta of GameMaker Studio 2.3, and I am so excited for a lot of reasons, but the biggest one is because 2.3 gives us access to a new resource called sequences. Sequences allow us to create a sequence of animations and events in our game using multiple resources. They're great for animation and cutscenes. There's a lot of things we can use them for, but I want to start with something simple. And if you're anything like me, you've been playing a lot of Animal Crossing. One thing that I love are the application icons when you open your Nook phone. There's these little animated graphics that show a simple animation. There's a few things going on in each one too that I think we can recreate in GameMaker. I like how each element in the graphic has its own motion. They can pulse, bob up and down, animate, and I like how some parts of it even extend past the border. It really makes the animation alive as they pop out of their frame. And these are the things that I want to make in my own icon. So let's get started. Alright, so I've imported 3 sprites into this project. I've got a mask, which is just a black box. I've got a player, which is just something I drew of a little character. I gave him a shield and a graphic of a sword. So I'm only going to need 4 sprites for the animation I have planned. So I'm going to open up our sequences folder, right click, and click on create and a new sequence. So the first thing we're going to do is take all of these sprite resources and move them into the track panel of a sequence. And what this is after I drag over a sprite into the track panel, you see I got something that's changed quite a bit. So all of the resources that I import along the track panel is called a track. So these 3 sprites are each track. So I have a player track, a shield track, and a sword track. Off to the right shows you each frame of animation of the sequence, right? So far this sequence will last for 60 frames, and I can change that just by typing in a new number here. I'm going to change it back to 60. I can either measure it in frames per second, or I can measure it in time, how long I would be in our minutes and seconds format. I'm going to leave it to frames for the time being. I know the game's going to run at 60 frames a second. I'm going to call this, 1 second, this animation so far. So the way this works is after I dropped down some tracks, you'll see these little colored boxes here, and this is for how long of the animation these tracks will appear for. So I'm going to focus on the player for a moment. So you can see that it only lasts for 2 frames, and I can use this scrub through the yellow playhead here to preview my animation just by scrubbing through. You can see after the second frame, it disappears, and that's definitely not what I want to happen. So I'm going to click, and I'm going to drag out that player sprite through the entire 60 frames. And now when I scrub through, you can see it's there. The sword and the shield need to be extended as well. I'll move those out. Now, why sequences are important is because they're for animation, right? It's either each one of these frames we can have any one of these tracks have a different position on the animation. We can have it do different actions. We can scale it. We can rotate it. We do all sorts of different and interesting things for each one of these tracks. So the way we do that is through keyframes. So let's talk about our player for a moment. If we were to have him start here on frame 0, notice that we have a position keyframe here. And you know there's a keyframe set because you'll get this little white diamond set at whatever frame the keyframe's at. So on frame 0, the position of the player is right over here. If we wanted to move it, all we would have to do is move our playhead over to frame 60 and physically move our character over. You can see this dotted line of animation to show where he starts on the last keyframe, which is on frame 0 right over here. Frame 60 is all the way to the right, so it's over here. And as I scrub my playhead through, you can see that GameMaker has done me a favor and filled in all the frames of animation, going from the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen, which is great. If I want to preview the animation, I can push play right here, and the sequence will play. Notice it just stopped. If I want it to loop, I can click on this and change the playback mode. So now it'll loop from 0 to 60, 0 to 60, 0 to 60. If I want to ping pong it back and forth, I can click this again. You can see that he moves left and right. Whatever I set the play mode to here in the IDE will be the play mode when it plays in my game. So because I want the animation to always repeat, I'm going to change this to looping. You can see what this looks like here. So because I don't want my animation to go left to right, I would like my character to bob up and down. I'm going to change this around a little bit. So I'm going to delete the last keyframe. I'm going to click on it, I push delete, and you can see now when I play the animation, I only have one keyframe of animation, so the player is going to stay right at frame 0, which is over here. I'm going to actually move that back to the center. I'm going to give him a simple bob up and down animation here. Oh, notice that my playhead wasn't on 0, so it created a new keyframe. Make sure that doesn't happen. So I'm going to make sure I'm at frame 0. I'm going to move him back to the center. I'm going to say I'm going to kind of wing it for now. Notice that I don't have to create a new keyframe. It does so automatically whenever I move my character. That's because this option right here is selected, automatically record changes. I can move my character without creating a new keyframe if I don't have that selected. But what if I did want a keyframe here without this option selected? I would go through, and this is my position parameter. I would click on this little keyframe, toggle key on, and as I click it, you can see that this has been created here in the center. I'm going to Control Z to undo that. So at frame 10, the character is going to move up a little bit. And I'm going to say at frame 20, I want him back right where he started. So there's two ways I can do that. Either I can move him down and kind of go back between frame 1 and 20 to see. But an easier way of doing that, I'm going to turn this. An easier way of doing that is just to copy the keyframe. So I'm going to leave my track head at frame 20. I'm going to click on the keyframe at frame 0, push Control C to copy, push Control Z to paste this same keyframe at frame 20. And so what that does is it takes the position that's saved at frame 0 and pastes it back at frame 20. That's where my track head's at. So frame 10 is still up here, but 0 and 20 are down here. You can see that character has a little bob to him. Bob, 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 bob. Notice though, there's no keyframes after that, so it stays at that position until the animation is over. If I were to play that, there's a bob and a wait. Right? So far, so good. The next thing I'm going to do is make my character hold a sword and a shield. As you can tell, as the animation is running, the sword and the shield aren't moving as well. Now, there's two ways we can do this. I'm going to move the shield out of the way for now. I'm going to hold the sword here. So this looks like a good position of where I want my character to hold the sword. The problem with this is, as I play the animation, the sword won't move with. I can do two things here. I can move the sword the same way I moved my player. I can open up the parameters for the sword. Notice this is blue rather than white or empty. So there's a keyframe here at frame 0. I can go to frame 10 and I can move the sword up. I can copy the keyframe and paste it out. Assuming this is here. Copied, trackhead, paste it, and you can see the sword will follow through. But there's a more interesting feature that I think fits us a little bit better, because what if we did something else later on down the line? So let's say we wanted our character, we said, oh, you know what, actually, maybe that's not high enough, and we want our character to move up a little bit more. I'd have to go through and I'd have to edit the sword and the shield, and that can be a little bit of a pain. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign, I'm going to delete these positional keyframes here for the sword. I'm going to take this sword track, I'm going to make it a child of the player track by making sure it's highlighted right on the center and clicking it here. And notice that now we have this little hierarchy tree. So now wherever the player is either positioned, rotated, or scaled, those transformations will continue through to all of its children, meaning that when the player moves, the sword moves in its same relative position. So I'm going to leave the sword right here, and that's actually all I have to do in order to make the sword move with the player. The reason why you see this little bit of lag here is because I have different keyframes still for the sword. So if I deleted those, it stays to its original position, which is at frame 0. So I'm going to move that back up. Right here. There it is. So I actually don't have to make any keyframes for the sword. I just have to give it a starting position because it's a child of the player. When the player moves, it'll take the sword with it. Now that's not exactly interesting. So first I'm going to take the same concept here and I'm going to make the shield. I'm going to move my track head back to 0 because I keep forgetting to do that. I'm going to take my shield and make it a child of the player. And then I'm just going to position the shield where I think it looks good right here. Fine. I'm going to preview my animation. So now we have the sword and the shield moving with the player. But it's not exactly interesting, right? It looks really stiff. Doesn't really look like the character's moving that much. So what I'm going to do is offset the sword and the shield's animation from the player. So I'm going to say at the peak of the jump, the little bob here, I'm going to take the sword. I'm going to move it up a little bit. And I'm going to take the shield and I'm going to move that up a little bit. And then I'm going to copy the keyframes from frame 0, paste them back on frame 20. So now I have this like rise and fall of the shield. So that's a little bit more in depth here, but I'm going to go one further. I'm going to say also at the top of the jump, I'm going to rotate these as well. The way I create a rotating parameter is I'm going to click on plus, I'm going to click on rotation. So now I have a track here for the rotation of the sword. So I'm going to keyframe this, which is automatically at 0. So I'm going to say at 10, I want this to be pointed up just a little bit. The sword I'm going to do the shield I'm going to do something different with. I'm actually going to add a parameter rotation by clicking this plus and clicking rotation again. I don't want this to be keyframed anywhere but frame 0 for now. I'm going to start the shield at a different position than 0. So I'm going to move it out a little bit and position it down. That way when we get to frame 10, I want the shield to be a little higher and I want him to straighten out the shield. And then at frame 20, where my character lands again, I want the shield to be crooked out. I'm actually going to move the shield out position-wise as well, a little bit away from his body. Call it that. I'm going to copy the position keyframe from frame 0 and paste it on frame 20. Control C and Control V again. And check that out. So we got a little bit of rotation here. The sword's looking a little funky. And that is because I didn't copy the starting keyframe from frame 0, frame 20, where it's a little bit angled. So now it's looking a little bit more smooth, right? It's got kind of a bob and a feel to it. The character looks alive, like he's actually shifting the sword and the shield with the motion of his body as he goes up and down. Something else I don't like, however, is it doesn't really look like the character's jumping. It looks like they're almost kind of moving on an elevated platform and there's not a lot of motion to the body. So I'm going to be scaling and stretching the player so that they look like they have a little squash and stretch to them. So I'm going to wait until the character lands right at frame 20. And I'm going to give the character a parameter track for scale. Now, because I don't need to mess with the sword and the shield, I'm going to click on these little arrows and collapse those down. So that way it's just a little bit easier for me to look at. I'm going to say at frame 20, I'm going to set a keyframe by clicking on scale. Notice that it doesn't have one right now. Click on it. I'm going to say by 2 frames later for the scale, I'm going to click on this and add another scale keyframe. I want the character to be at it's X scale and it's Y scale. So this is how wide it is and this is how tall it is. So I want it to be 110, so I want it a little bit wider and I want it a little bit shorter. I'm going to say 2 frames later than that, I want it a little bit thinner and a little bit taller. And then I'm going to say 2 frames after that, I want it back at, not 1,000, 100 and 100%. So what this should do is it'll land, get a little chubbier, get a little taller, snap back to normal. Notice that when we do this, the scaling, notice the sword and the shield scale with it. Again, that's because we created the sword and the shield as children of the player. So they will take on any transformations that the parent has, whether that's position, scale, rotation. In this case, it's going to be the scale that they're inheriting. But we don't have to create keyframes for them. It just takes on the transformation of the player that's keyframed, the parent that's keyframed, which would be the player in this case. Let's preview our animation. So I noticed we've got a nice little jiggle, but it's not quite a little squash. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag these out. So I did it every 2 frames. So let's move these keyframes out just a little bit. And I'm just going to kind of ebb and flow of just experimenting, seeing where this takes us, taking the animation. Now, something that's interesting is, well, that looks a lot better already. We can actually see the bounce of the character going through up and down. So now we got kind of like this little jump up and this little resting point where the character will bob. We can also edit the keyframes as the animation is playing. Looks like it stops here. That's looking a little better. If we want to see the animation slower, we can actually change. Right now, this animation is playing at 60 frames a second. Highlight this number. So I'm going to put 30 just to see it in half speed, just to kind of see what's going on here. Kind of nice. You got this nice little squash and bounce. I'm going to leave that back at 60 frames a second. So now we have our animation. One thing that's different, though, about the little app icons that we're trying to recreate is everything was conformed in a box, right? So sequences have something really nice called masks. So we're going to add in another track here, and that's going to be SPR mask. And I believe it's this button right here. It's going to be add new clip mask. I'm going to click on it. And it's going to give us 2 folders, a mask and a subject. The mask is going to be our mask, clearly. So I'm going to click and drag that in here. And our player is going to be our subject. That's what we want to mask. So notice when we did that, its head got cut off, and there's a reason for that, and I'll show you. Let me play the animation so we can kind of see what's going on here. One thing we want to do is the reason why it's disappearing after 2 frames, because this mask here is only available frames. To find a way to take that mask and drag it out to 6 frames. Now let's preview the animation. Notice their head's getting cut off. You can kind of see this round boxy shape. So if we were to look at the mask sprite shape, it's this rounded kind of rectangle, right? So what this is doing is think of this as a window, and it's using this as a window to look at our sequence animation that we created of the player with the sword and the shield. So I'm going to go back into the sequence, and right now you just have a window into it. All right, so notice that when we play the animation, there's a bit of strangeness going on. Now that window is just centered a little too low on this sprite. We want his feet to be covered and his head to be bouncing up and down. So we're going to move that window up a little bit. Make sure the track head is back at the 0 frame. Just like any other element, I can click on the mask and I can click to drag it up to expose a different view in that window. So when I preview that animation, you can see that the correct part is showing. Note that his head is being cut off a little bit. I'm okay with that. It's just a stylistic choice. We can make it higher, make it lower, make it however we want. So something I want to do is add a background to this window, because right now it just looks like his head and his feet are getting cut off, so we want to give it some context. I know I've imported the sprite of the mask as the mask of this player animation, but I'm also going to add it as a background because it's going to be the same shape of the mask. So I'm going to click my sprite and I'm going to drag it at the bottom of this track, and I'm going to move it all the way down. I'm going to double click to give it a new name as to not confuse it with the other one. I'm going to call this background, and I'm going to move the position match mask. When I play the animation, it disappears because I need to move the track head back to 0 when I import it. Make sure that this extends across all 60 frames so it shows the entire time. And then we've got some context into how our animation is being masked. So we have 3 different components going on here. We've got a mask, a subject, and a background. We've defined the mask as the sprite of the mask. Our subject is our player, the sword, and the shield with the animation that goes along with it. And below all of that, we've added a background to give the mask some context to the icon. So now when we play, we've got a completed animation. Character jumps up and down. The mask is taping off the top and the bottom of our sprite, and it's confined by this black image. And we've got a nice little icon of a character with a sword and shield bouncing up and down, something that Animal Crossing would be happy to have.